Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orientalism History. My guest today is Professor Khalid Blankinship, professor of religion at Temple University, as well as a historian who specializes in Islamic history and has authored several books on the topic. Today, we talked about the Umayyad Caliphate, the second Islamic dynasty to rule over the Muslim world and Middle East after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Professor Khalid is a wealth of knowledge, and his ability to rattle off dates, events, and names is truly remarkable. We discussed the roots of the Umayyad Caliphate, the economy of the Umayyads, and how they still use Persian and Roman coins hundreds of years after the defeat of those empires. His impressive understanding of the geographical reach of the Caliphate, which reached all the way from Spain to the west to the borders of China in the east, is truly remarkable. Expect to also learn about how the Middle East slowly became Muslim after hundreds of years. That and much more. Great. Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Khalid. Um, Today we'll be discussing the Umayyad Caliphate, and let's just get right into it, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Great. So maybe we can just start off with who are the Umayyads and how was the Umayyad Caliphate established?
Okay. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, which was early caliphate of Islam, existed between 660 and 750. Muawiyah is believed to have been saluted as caliph in 660, actually, before Ali Karramallahu Wajha was assassinated in 661, so often you find it 661 to 750. But anyway, that's the period of it. So it lasted for about 89 or 90 solar years, which, as dynasties and empires go, is not very long. In other words, something like 3 generations. Extended over the area of the Middle East. It already had control of the Middle East that it inherited from the Rashidun caliphs in 661, and then through a series of military campaigns that actually I traced in the first chapter of my book, The End of the Jihad State, the reign of Hisham ibn Abdul Malik and the collapse of the Umayyads. It stretched over a very large area that made it the largest territorial empire in territorial area up till that time. So it was larger in territorial extent than the Roman Empire or the Chinese Empire or the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire and so on. However, its population was probably not as large as either the Roman or Chinese Empire because of the large amount of desert areas and because of the general decline of civilization that happened in the late antiquity and that led to the so-called Dark Ages.
So you have this massive empire stretching from Persia all the way to Spain.
Yeah, stretching from Spain and Morocco in the west to Turkestan and eastern Afghanistan and Kashmir in the east, including the modern territory of Pakistan, most of it, and sometimes it's said from, Spain to China. However, it's sort of like to the western border of China, not inside of China.
And just going back to the roots, did it start immediately after Ali, or I think you mentioned it started before Ali?
Well, it started because of the first civil war in Islam between Muawiyah and Ali. And this was the first fitna, and this was the first discord that happened in Islam because of the assassination or killing of the Caliph Uthman in 656, which led to Ali being enthroned. And Ali's enthronement as caliph was never recognized by Muawiyah in Syria, who was the governor of Syria. Had succeeded his brother Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan as the governor of Syria in 640. And so by 656, he had already been governor of Syria for 16 years. And when we say Syria here, we do not mean the modern country of Syria, but we mean what's called geographical Syria, or Bilad al-Sham, sometimes referred to as the Levant, which includes the lands of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, where Israel is. And that entire territory, that was called Sham in Arabic, Syria in the Roman Empire. And so Muawiyah was the governor of that entire region. And he had a lot of troops under his command because they faced off against the remaining part of the Roman Empire, which was in Anatolia mainly, and whose capital was at Istanbul. And so that was the largest remaining state that opposed the Umayyads. And even though it had lost many of its territories to the Caliphate, it retained loyalty and control over the Greek-speaking areas as it was the Greek Empire, and those areas fought very hard against the Muslims and resisted Muslim expansion in that direction. So there was a lot of warfare that took place on that front. And so Muawiyah had been the governor of Syria for a long time, and he remained the governor of Syria for several years, but was not acknowledging Ali as caliph. And he never acknowledged Ali as caliph. And he fought a battle with him at Siffin, and he engaged in the arbitration that took place around 658, 659, and eventually was himself saluted as the Amir al-Mu'mineen instead of Ali, and then Ali was assassinated. When Ali was assassinated, his son Hassan ibn Ali became the Amir al-Mu'mineen. And after a very short reign of several months, he surrendered to Muawiyah in the same year, 661, in exchange for a general amnesty. And so that meant that Muawiyah was now the unchallenged Amir al-Mu'mineen, the caliph of all the Muslims in the entire state. After that, the struggle to expand the caliphate resumed.
So Ali becomes the caliph, and then what happened? Was there a centralization of the state? Was there a reform in terms of how the administration was run compared to the Rashidun? And then obviously there's a lot of territorialization.
Well,
can you just expand on the early days of the Umayyad Caliphate?
Yes, the Rashidun Caliphate was not highly articulated in the sense of a modern state. That means it did not have a lot of institutions such as we think of a modern state as having. For that matter, even the much more articulated Roman Empire or Chinese Empire did not have modern type institutions either, because technology was not modern technology. The state was much less intrusive into the affairs of the people, and the people were much more self-governing than they are today. And so it's somewhat difficult for modern people to imagine this situation, but that's how it was. And because the early Muslims did not have a previous tradition of a state, so as the state mushroomed from the city-state of Medina that had been under the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam for several years, and then began to acquire somewhat other territory, it was not bureaucratized at all. And so when it's quite striking that the city-state in Medina has no officialdom other than the Prophet himself, that's it. And the acquisition of Mecca led to him appointing Attab ibn Asid as governor of Mecca, which was the first time he'd actually appointed a governor to sit in another place and represent the state there than in Mecca. When Khaybar had been taken in the previous year, 629 in the north, the conquest of it led to a total surrender, but the people there were told that, well, now we're going to send an official called al-Kharras who will collect the tribute from you. And that's it. And then the Muslims left, and the Khaybaris, the people of Khaybar itself, they were then self-governing again. They governed themselves, and they had to collect enough tribute to pay to the state to show that they were part of the Medinan state now. And so when much larger conquests took place in Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Iran, which all took place under Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph, when these much larger conquests took place, the Muslims had no concept of governing such a state in a bureaucratic way. Rather, they had merely the idea of collecting tribute at first. And so they left the administrative arrangements the same as they had been, and therefore the same officials basically continued to administer these civilized areas, these citified, urbanized areas of Syria and Egypt under Roman law, and Iraq and Iran under the Sasanian or Persian arrangements. And it took a long time for the caliphate to alter these arrangements. And at first, they didn't need to. Yes, the caliph was the ruler, and he had to be consulted, and he was important for things. Mostly, the caliph was ruling over the Muslims. And the Muslims in these places established the great congregational masjids, such as the Masjid of Kufa, which is now a ruin. Well, first of all, they established military settlements, which were Basra and Kufa in Iraq, and then later others farther east. And they established similar settlements in Syria, in the existing towns, and in Egypt at El Fustat, and so on. And they would found a masjid that would be the place where the people would collect and worship, and they would also hear the governor harangue the troops. And the governor in each place, he would lead the salah. So it would be, the governor would be described as being al-harb wa salah, meaning in charge of warfare and prayer. And then someone else would be in charge of financial affairs, and that would simply be the local person who was originally in charge of that in that place. So it took a long time for this to become elaborated into some kind of a Muslim state, although that did take place gradually under the Umayyads, and the Umayyads set the pattern for that then prevailed throughout the rest of Muslim history.
So the Umayyads were not just responsible for the revolution, but they also created what we would consider a modern state. They also
Well, not a modern state. They created a state that gradually became Muslim in its identity and dimensions and so on, and it adopted various measures that made it more so. Most of these measures took place under the Caliph Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, who ruled from 685 to 705. And so that was quite a long time later. 685, this is like 63 years after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad. And so Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was not a Sahabi, he was a Tabi'i, because he knew people who had been Sahaba, but he wasn't one himself. And he presided over a caliphate which tried to reorganize the administration under a single rubric instead of having Roman administration in the western half and Persian administration in the eastern half. It tried to reorganize it under a single rubric, and it considerably succeeded in doing this. So one of the reforms was the reform of the currency system, the money. The original money that had been used, which is mentioned in the Quran, where it mentions dirham and it mentions dirham or dinar. These were the two types of currency. Dirham was silver, dinar gold, but they were not made by the Muslims. The dinar was the solidus, which was the gold currency of the Byzantine or Roman Empire, and the dirham was the silver currency of the Persian Empire. And the Muslims continued to allow these coins to be made just as they had been made before. And there was also a copper currency that was smaller, and the unit of that was called fils in Arabic, which came from the word pholos, which was the Roman name for the current coin. And so these coins, at first, the most widespread of them became the silver coins, silver dirhams. They had on the one side the picture of the Persian king, and on the other side they had a Zoroastrian fire altar with the sacred fire and two priests attending the fire. That was the Persian Empire's coinage. The Muslims continued this coinage, continued issuing it, and eventually they started to add on the margin, Bismillah, in the name of Allah. Or they would write Alhamdulillah, or they would write Jaiz, which meant permissible or legal, or they would write Tayyib, which meant good, in other words, good for transactions. So they would even write non-religious type things. And then they kept the picture of the deposed, long dead Persian king and the picture of the Zoroastrian fire altar and the priests. And nobody blinked at that or thought that there was anything strange with that. And then when the Roman Empire started issuing new gold coins, that instead of just having the picture of the emperor on one side and the cross on the other side, replaced the cross with the picture of Christ. At that point, the Muslims rebelled against these coins and issued their own coins. And the first ones showed the Caliph Abdul Malik ibn Marwan standing, holding on to his sword, just like a Roman emperor. Like the picture of the Roman emperor was replaced by the picture of the Caliph. That was somehow rejected at that time by the Muslims, and they replaced it with a purely epigraphic coinage, meaning a coinage that contained only writing and no images or pictures. And that set the tone for Muslim coinage down to the present day. So
That's
it took a
disgusting.
while before that started. Another reform that was taken was that the languages that were used for all correspondence were Greek and probably Syriac or Persian. And these were the languages used in the government offices of the preceding empires. Under Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, he issued a decree that henceforth all the public record keeping, all the correspondence of the governors and so on would be done in Arabic, not in these other languages.
What year was that?
About 696. And so he Arabicized the Diwan, which means public record offices. And that was a very major step, but it took a long time to be applied. Even though he decreed it, that didn't mean it happened right away. So we have the correspondence of the governor of Egypt, Qurra ibn Sharik, the Arab governor of Egypt, Muslim governor of Egypt, on papyrus from Egypt from the year 715, and his letters are all in Greek. That meant that he didn't yet have Muslim secretaries writing in Arabic. Instead, he wrote he dictated the letters, and they were translated into Greek by the Greek scribes and then sent out in Greek to the people. And so it was still using Greek in the year 715. They were still using Persian in Khorasan until Nasr ibn Sayyar, who became the governor of Khorasan, maybe around 740. And so it delayed very greatly. There's also a story about the Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, who reigned from 724 to 743, how he carried on some correspondence of his own and wrote his own letter to the governor of Yemen. And that means that the Caliph Hisham, at least, was literate, and that he carried on some correspondence in Arabic, and he had Arabic writing secretaries at the caliphal palace. And so that would be that by that time, then, because he's late in the Umayyad times, that this Arabicization had taken place. And of course, it was pretty complete by the end of the Umayyad Empire. And then they bequeathed that to the Abbasids and their later successors. And Arabic became the general language of government activity and everything else in this empire.
So kind of summarizing, it sounds like both the Rashiduns and the Umayyads, they conquered a massive amount of area, but then they just left everything kind of as is. They left people to believe their own religious beliefs, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, at
They left the
first, what could
economy
they
and the
do?
coinage.
See, try to imagine what could they do. They, first of all, didn't have any training or idea about administration themselves. So they were coming into this as a new thing. And all they had ever done before in tribal Arabia was that if someone was conquered, they would, pay tribute and then continue to be self-governing. That was their model. They didn't have an imperial model where you had a central government and you had governors and armies and administration. It took a while before all of that got developed. And the Umayyads get credit for developing it.
So can we talk a little bit about the early Umayyad and the conquests and military campaigns that they
Yes,
undertook?
the military campaigns are very remarkable, and it's usually considered amazing and somewhat miraculous that all these military campaigns took place, that this despised population of Arabians from the Arabian Peninsula came out of the Arabian Peninsula, completely conquered the Persian Empire under Omar ibn al-Khattab, and conquered much of the Roman Empire as well. And then under the Umayyads went beyond that to conquer Turkestan, to conquer the Brahmanical kingdom of Sind, in what is now Pakistan and India, and in the west conquered Spain, which was the Gothic kingdom, a Visigothic kingdom of Spain. So they conquered several other places as well under the Umayyads. And the Umayyads continued to direct this effort outward because a large part of their self-legitimation was, we are claiming the earth for God's rule. And so everyone should be obedient to us, and we are expanding the area under the control of the caliphate, and this is something that is decreed by God to happen, and so that this is something good, and all of you Muslims should support it. Now, inside of Islam, the Muslims actually were not so enthusiastic for the Umayyads. The Umayyads were based in Syria, so there was considered to be a Syrian bias. The Umayyad army was heavily recruited from Syria, and because of that, the other places, especially Iraq, didn't like that and were frequently in rebellion against the Umayyads. But nonetheless, the Umayyads were able to orchestrate all of these conquests, and they did use the armies from the other places to accomplish that to a large extent. So the Kufans and Basrans were engaged in fighting in India and Turkestan, and the North African Muslims that were settled in Egypt and North Africa tried to conquer those areas. Since fewer people went to settle in Tunisia, it was difficult to conquer that area, and the mountainous people there, the Amazigh or Berbers, resisted this furiously, but they eventually, through the mediacy of Musa ibn Nusayr, who himself was a Nabati, meaning a non-Arab Syriac speaker from the area of the Fertile Crescent originally. Through his invitation to the Amazigh to become Muslims, they all became Muslims at once, joined the Arabs, entered the army under their own units and the same rights as Arabs had theoretically, and then crossed over and conquered Spain, with Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa ibn Nusayr conquered Spain. So that was accomplished through the first large non-Arab people to become Muslims, who were the Amazighi people of North Africa. So these conquests then were accomplished that way. The two empires that were conquered, the Persian and the Roman, had alienated their own people before by being too imperious, too centralizing, too bureaucratic, and especially too taxing. And so the people disliked that they were doing all of this taxation. It was heavy on them. And also there were religious controversies because the peoples of Egypt and Syria were not Greek-speaking by and large, even though Greek was used as the lingua franca, just like English is used all over the world today as the lingua franca. But that didn't mean that their home language was Greek. It was in Egypt, Egyptian or Coptic, and in Syria it was Aramaic or Syriac, and etc. So it was different languages in different places. And these people did not resist the Muslims coming in and taking over their area because they just thought, well, it's just another empire. Why should we support the Romans? And we don't support the Roman Empire. And that was when the Muslims touched the Greeks that were in the Greek-speaking area in Anatolia, what is now Turkey and Greece and so on. Those people resisted furiously for centuries because they were loyal to the empire, the Greek Empire, but the non-Greeks were not. So conquests were accomplished rather easily. Like Syria fell after one decisive battle, which was the Battle of Yarmouk. That was it. After that, Emperor Heraclius famously said, "Farewell, Syria." And the Persian Empire was conquered in two battles, Qadisiyah and Nahawand. And basically that was it. And then the Persian armies were defeated. And likewise, the Brahmanical kingdom of Sind was conquered in two battles. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain was conquered in one battle. So the resistance to the conquests was not so much, and that helped to facilitate them. Nevertheless, it was quite amazing that the Semitic people established this large Semitic empire for the first time. That had never happened before. It was amazing that the land of Syria became the metropolitan province of a world-class empire for the first and last time in its history. There was never a world-class empire centered in Syria, not before, not after. It was the first time. That was the time Damascus shone as the world capital. That never happened before. It never happened after.
Let's shift gears now a little bit and talk about the cultural and scientific contributions. And can you maybe emphasize and give a summary on the contributions that the Umayyad Caliphate made to the fields of science, medicine, and philosophy?
Right. Most of those contributions came about later under the Abbasids, but the Umayyads do have some contributions nevertheless. I already went through how they were establishing and articulating a state, so a kind of background and motif for a whole new civilization was growing out of that, the Islamic civilization, and that's certainly a significant accomplishment. There were also other specific things, however, which began slowly to happen. One of these was that the Muslims had to establish where the Qibla was in order to know which direction to prostrate themselves to in salah, in prayer. And to know what the Qibla was, it's not an obvious thing. You can't just go from one place to another in the earth and say, oh, I know where the Qibla is, and have no devices, no compasses, no internet, no nothing to tell you where it is. You can use the sky to tell you what latitude it is. That is because you can see the North Star, how high that is in the sky, and you can measure the angle of the North Star. And that will give you your latitude. So that was even known anciently. But longitude, that is where you are with respect to east and west, that was only made measurable by the British in the 18th century. Before that, they couldn't measure longitude at all. It wasn't measurable exactly. And consequently, the early Muslims, when they went out, they just kind of stuck the Qibla wherever it was. They just said, well, it's that way. And they didn't actually calculate it carefully. Because of that, all the Qiblas in the oldest masjids are way off. They're off in all kinds of different directions askew. Centuries later, they're still off. If you look at a map of the city of Cairo showing the Qiblas of all the masjids in Cairo, they're all cattywampus to each other. They're not directly aligned in the Qibla direction. And so the early Qiblas were various. However, there was a desire to know what the exact Qibla was, and this aroused an interest in geography, which is a scientific study, and in map making, and in trying to figure out the exact directions of things. And this was a scientific endeavor which had been going on previously with the Greeks and the Romans and so on before. And the Muslims continued and eventually greatly elaborated. So that was a process that was also begun with the Umayyads. Another area was linguistics. The Arabic language was new to writing. That is, there are a few inscriptions from before Islam that are in Arabic, usually not written in the Arabic script we would recognize. But nevertheless, there are a few Arabic inscriptions showing the idea of Arabic writing. It can't come into existence, but it was new. And today, the oldest work in Arabic is the Quran. So the Quran was revealed in Arabic and written down in Arabic, more importantly, right at that time. And in fact, recent scientific studies of the Quran and radiocarbon dating of the pages of the earliest Quranic manuscripts show that those manuscripts date back to only a few years after the Prophet ﷺ died, as early as 650 and so on. And so that means that already they were writing this down. And of course, it's very famous that there was a codex or a book of the Quran that was written down at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and then was given to Abu Bakr, and Abu Bakr gave it to Omar, and Omar gave it to his daughter Hafsa, contributed it when Uthman issued the official version of the Quran in his time, was circa 750 or something, 650 or something like that. So anyway, this work was ongoing, and they had to decide, well, how do you represent the letters and sounds? So they started thinking about phonology. They thought about lexicography, meaning the dictionary terms, the vocabulary of the language. They thought about grammar. And eventually they contributed far, far more to these things than the Greeks did. And also eventually rhetoric as well, which I wrote about in my book, The Inimitable Quran.
So you previously mentioned how most of the people conquered spoke Persian or Greek or Syriac. There must have been also a lot of non-Muslims. Can you just talk a little bit about the Umayyads' approach to religious tolerance and the treatment of non-Muslims within the
Well, the one thing is that when we see on the map this thing that's labeled Caliphate, and we see the largest extent of the Umayyad Caliphate, and we think, oh, a great Muslim state. Well, Muslim in the sense that the ruler was a Muslim, okay, but not Muslim in the sense the population was Muslim. The Muslims were a small minority of the population. The Muslim population in the Umayyad Caliphate can hardly have exceeded 10% in most of the time. And of course, Arabia became all Muslim. So that was the Muslim part of the caliphate. But everywhere else, the people were not Muslims, and it took them a while to become Muslim. Some people have made studies of this. It's very difficult to study the rate at which people embraced Islam. The Amazigh people of North Africa embraced Islam the earliest, and right behind them were the Khorasanis, who are Khorasani Persian-speaking people from northeastern Iran and what is now Turkestan, that is Uzbekistan and northern Afghanistan. So these people from far away from the center, they embraced Islam first. And the people that were close to the center, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, they lagged, and it was much a longer time before they embraced Islam. So one scholar estimated that the Muslims became 50% in Egypt in about the year 950. That is about 300 years after the conquest, or maybe about the year 1000, 350 years after the conquest. And they became 50% of the population of geographical Syria about 600 years after the conquest. So it took hundreds and hundreds of years for Islam to spread in those areas because people had established religions there. Pakistan, it's estimated that in Sindh, the Buddhist religion, which was the majority religion there, disappeared in about 200 years. But the Hindu religion resisted and remained there, so that at the time of the Muslim conquest in 711 and on, the people of Sindh were about 40% Hindus. And by the time the British came in the 1800s, they were about 25% Hindus. So in other words, Hinduism only went down from 40% to 25% in 1100 years. And Islam spread very slowly, and there was definitely not any kind of effort to force people to become Muslims. This false image of Islam was spread by the sword. Certainly not. Because, first of all, the people were in the majority. How are you going to spread Islam by the sword? And secondly, who wants a bunch of insincere, forced converts in their religion? Nobody would want that. And the people, if they were forced, would escape right back to their own religion as soon as they possibly could. Now, when Islam became overwhelmingly the majority later, there was a lot of pressure on these minorities, and therefore one would think there was more inclination for them to become Muslim. No, they resisted fiercely. And so it's thought that the Copts in Egypt already became 7% of the population, maybe by 1300, and by 1900, they were still 7% of the population. Today, because of emigration, they've become less, but they were, they kept a certain percentage of the population of Egypt over a very long period. And the Muslims were tolerant of and accepted the practice of these religions. The Quran states that the people of the book have to be protected, who are defined basically as the Jews and the Christians. The Samaritans, who were a religion derived from or separated from Judaism, but separate from Judaism, were also included under that rubric. So they were considered a people of the book too, because they venerated the Torah. But other people were also brought in under the single hadith that says about the Zoroastrians, accept the payment from them and do not marry their women or eat their slaughtered meat. And that means that they are in a category less than the Jews and Christians, but are still protected community, and their religion is licit and permissible. And so there are still Zoroastrians in Iran to this day, a very small minority to be sure, but they are there, and they're even represented in the parliament of Iran by one representative. And likewise, the same was extended to Hindus and Buddhists further east when the Muslims encountered them. So there was generally a tolerance toward the practice of the other religion. In the contest with the Roman Empire, this tolerance was tested because there was also a suspicion that the Christians in areas of Syria and Egypt support the Roman Empire, even though in the end they really didn't. And that led to certain restrictions imposed really from Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, and public displays of Christianity and so on. They still could practice their religion in their churches, and that was never.
So I read somewhere that the non-Muslims have to pay the jizya tax, and then Muslims have to pay the halal tax. What are the rates of those taxes? Do we have more details? Is it actually beneficial to be a non-Muslim because the rate of jizya is actually less than the rate of halal, or is that not true?
Not really. There isn't sufficient information to assess that. First of all, number one, there was no central administration of, so each place had different ways of handling it. And so the condition that was in one place was different than another. It mattered whether the cities conquered had been conquered by force or had surrendered on terms, which usually was the case. Mostly they surrendered on terms, and the terms often were that you pay a certain fixed sum as a tax and you worry about how to get it. And so instead of saying that you'd have a Muslim tax collector taking the tax from every non-Muslim who would come and pay, Certainly under the Umayyads, what went on was that the non-Muslims under their own administration were expected to collect the tax themselves and pay a certain limit. And then they would divide among their own people to pay it according to however they did. And so different people probably paid different rates, even in the same city at the same time. Later on, this was found, not sufficiently articulated in a regular way. And so under later rulers after the Umayyad, this was articulated more into a general thing. So under the Ottoman Empire and its predecessors, you might be able to tell how much the jizya tax was in a certain case. The jizya often was not collected. It ended up being massively not collected in later Islamic history. It was given up in the Ottoman Empire. It was given up in the Mughal Empire. And it ended up being not collected. And it was in the books of fiqh, it's a head tax. And so you pay a head tax, a jizya of the people individually. And the head tax on the Muslims was the zakat. And the zakat was also centrally, and that was considered a head tax on the Muslims on certain types of property that they held. So in a way, it was a kind of property tax, more like a personal property tax. And it was not an income tax. And one should never think zakat is an income tax, as some websites have. It was not an income tax then, it's not an income tax now, it never. And there were two other taxes, which were the main sources of income, with the haraj, which was the tax taken on land owned by non-Muslims, and the ushr, which was the tax taken on land owned by Muslims. That's in the books of fiqh, but in actual practice, there was practically no distinction between these, and because lands often change, if you had a land that was, say, owned by a non-Muslim, so it was under haraj, so then did the tax change when a Muslim acquired the land? No, probably not. And so it's an extremely vexated question to try to assess whether the people were benefiting or paying more. And you find both of these things asserted, that people were paying less, people were paying more. It's not possible to determine that.
Great. Super appreciate that deep insight. Can we talk a little bit, before we wrap, about the caliphate's kind of origins and how that influenced the early development of the Shia-Sunni divide? You mentioned things like the fitna. Can you dive a bit deeper into that and talk about things like the Battle of Karbala?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. And I also wrote an article about that, or Khilafa and Imama, offices, and Khalifa or Caliph, and used variously. The caliphs held all three of those titles. They were called imams, caliphs, obviously, and they were called Amir al-Mu'min, the commander of the faithful or the commander of the believers. That was the title. So, early titles. And the way they developed was, of course, the caliphate was created when the Prophet died, and the Ansar attempted to, and this is even in Sahih al-Bukhari, the Ansar attempted to elect Sa'd ibn Ubadah as the Emir of Medina, because now they wanted to reassert their own proprietorship over the basis and to give the proprietorship to the Qurayshis, who were a very small minority compared to the Medinans. And because the Medinans were divided, Khazraj and the Aus, the Khazraj being more dominant, the Aus didn't want Khazraji Sa'd ibn Ubadah to be the emir, and so they sent people to get Abu Bakr Umar and Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah to come quickly to the meeting, and they came and found the stormy meeting. They were able eventually to Abu Bakr install as emir. So he was called emir. That was it. And he did not get the allegiance body, because various persons refused allegiance. He worked patiently to try to get people to allegiance instead of using force on them and so on. But under Omar, it became required that you pay allegiance. Title of was raised to Amir al-Mu'mineen to try to show the Caliph had a superior power of command over everyone else state. That was the development of Omar. And the title of Khalifa, that is attested for Uthman ibn Affan and after him. And it was Khalifatul, meaning Allah's deputy on the earth. And that was the title that the caliphs themselves used, even though the hadith books say the title was Khalifat Rasulullah, the successor of a prophet, but that's not what the caliphs used. The caliphs used Khalifatullah directly, and there's a substantial difference in meaning between course. And so that was the office. Now, was a political office necessary for the survival of Islam? The consensus of the companions was that it was. And so they installed and the caliphate grew after that and became an established thing. It became a state that was associated with Islam. Later on, because the tie between the caliphate and the state was broken, and today and for many hundreds of years, the ulama liking for the idea of the state interfering in religion. And that has been the model that has been handed down from the Middle Ages, that the state should not interfere in the religion at all. Some modern people, influenced by modern nationalism, want to restore caliphate, which is a project that probably cannot succeed. Too much opposition would be by it. And also, it would not be a beneficial thing as far as Islam and its practice are concerned. Early caliphate, nevertheless, existed in form. Idea was that the caliphs were supposed to be these ideal rulers. Eventually, caliphal idealism was circulated by hadiths that the caliphs should be ideal persons, weren't. So there always had the scholars running behind them with a club over their heads, the rulers, the caliphs did, that were saying, you aren't really worthy of this office. You aren't really good rulers. You're profane rulers. You have all of this corruption and all of this evil doing and all murder and so on. Well, you can't run a state without. That is, politics is ground of insincerity, skullduggery, backstabbing, etc. Whereas religion is the ground of sincerity, devotion, loyalty, and such things, is the very opposite of politics. Do not overlap and never shall meet. So that was what the caliphs found they're problematic. And Umayyad caliphs never enjoyed the support of the populace. They the people who benefited from them, such as the Syrian army in the caliphate, and everyone else, especially as more people became Muslims and all gradually spread, Muslim people had nothing to gain from supporting the caliphs. At a much later stage, Abbasid Caliph and Nasir, who reigned from 1225, made a really interesting effort to re-religionize and re-legitimate the Abbasid Caliphate at a time when he was only ruling of the modern country of Iraq. So the Caliphate had lost all of its far-spread temporal power, but he was trying to get that back and made very interesting attempts to become himself personally a muhaddith, to support to send out diplomas appointing the sultans as the sultans from the caliph himself, as if they were subordinate to him. It's a very interesting effort. And what from it, Suyuti said, nobody should pay attention to his hadith book because it was not made sincerely. It was made for political reasons. Well, there are. You can't win for losing. And anyone who wants Caliphate back, I challenge them to show that they could do better than Nasr did. That they should look at the Caliph and Nasr exactly, and Nasr particularly, and also his successors, Zahir of Mustansir, and even those killed. During that, Indian summer, the last period of the Abbasid Caliphate, when the caliphs tried to reassert the religious authority and to create a kind of religious legitimation for the caliph, what happened to it? And so, challenge: can you do better than a Nasr? And Nasser must have been a really sharp individual. He was very innovative and so on, but I difficult. So this is the caliphate. Now, you asked about Sunni Shia split. Let me address. But so the caliphs had the idea, you obey us. And so the Umayyad Caliphate was, our caliphate's already legitimate. The right rulers are already in power. We're expanding the area ruled by Islam. We need loyalty. That was their pitch. But the dissatisfied had other ways of seeing. And one of the immediate ways was, oh no, the wrong people are in power. It should be the Prophet's own household. You Umayyads are enemies of the Prophet. You only became Muslims when Mecca surrendered at the very minute, a couple of years, say about 2.5 years before the Prophet passed away. And therefore you didn't even know Islam earlier on than that, and you resisted against it at Badr and at Uhud and Khandaq and so on. So why should we pay any attention to you? You don't deserve it. It should go back to the family of the Prophet, the close relatives of the Prophet. And that was the da'wah which the Abbasids, their state, when they called for an oath of allegiance to a secret candidate who was labeled Rida min al-Bayt, the satisfactory candidate from the Prophet's own household. And they didn't say who they were. So all the people who the descendants of Ali and Fatima supported the Abbasid revolution. When the Abbasid case was revealed, they said, oh, well, this is a trick. That's only the Prophet's uncle. It's not close enough. We should have the Prophet's own descendants in lineage of Hassan or Hussein as the caliphs. And so that was the claim that then was legitimated and formulated into them as time went on. And of course, that's entirely normal thing that you would be able to say, that, we should have the Prophet's own household. In fact, that in the Mormon church, which has nothing to Islam, in Utah, the Mormons' original prophet, Joseph Smith, was succeeded by Brigham Young, and then by an elected series of people who are said to be elected by the God moving the council of the apostles to elect the right person. They have a prophetic succession. And the Mormons have a living prophet. But a minority of Mormons went out against it. No, we have to have the direct lineal descent, the male line of Joseph Smith. And so the reconstructed Mormon church has a lineal descendant of Joseph Smith as its living prophet, and do not recognize the prophet of majority of Mormons in Salt Lake City. They are at odds with each other. They are virtual Mormon Shias, in fact.
That's so interesting. I would have never imagined.
So it's a quite normal thing for people to say that the descendants of Master, they ought to be the ones we're following. Now, in Islam, there's a basis for saying, no, the best should be the one, or something. I mean, other counter discourses against that. But this is how the Sunnis and Shias have opposed each other very much over history. The other thing is that Sunnism and Shiism themselves did not really gel as religions until after 750. So that in the early period, they did not really differ on religious practice. They just differed on who should be in charge of the state. And because the Umayyads were very dictatorial, the Shias couldn't, or that is, the people of the Prophet's household, could promote themselves openly at all, and had to, cool it in that way. But when the Abbasids came to power, because they were very weak since they had no legitimacy in the beginning and had to clutch itself, much came out. And part of that came in developments that led to the Sunni and Shia. Under the Umayyads, the split was al-Alawiyya and al-Uthmaniyya. That is, you either supported that Uthman was killed legitimately, in which case you supported Alawiyya, or that Uthman was killed pressed, in which case you supported the Umayyads. And so that was the split. But when the Umayyads collapsed, some people thought, well, we should try to reabsorb the Shia, that is the Alids, into our thing. Now that the Uthmanid side collapsed, we should, and the Abbasids, the ruler, to reabsorb the people who favored Ali. So started saying, we'll continue. Now we'll declare adalat al-sahaba. We agree to that all of the companions of the Prophet were good. So we'll say as well. And we have four legitimate caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali. Uthman and Ali were opposed to each other. They are now brought together in this Sunni, the basis of Sunnism. Many of the people who were pro-Ali joined the Sunni consensus, but a minority of them rejected that, and so on.
Thank you. So you touched on this topic briefly, which is the decline and the fall of the Umayyad dynasty, which led to the Abbasid revolution. Can you talk a little bit about the underlying currents that drove that revolution? Why were people not happy with the Umayyads, and what exactly was the Abbasid revolution?
Yeah, okay. Several things had happened. One thing that was very significant was Islam had spread to non-Arab people in Africa and in Turkestan and northeastern Iran. It hadn't spread much elsewhere to non-Muslim people, but it had spread in those areas. So those areas to become Muslim and have Muslim populations in them as well. And Arabia had a Muslim population, and then there were Muslim armies all over the place. And the Muslim armies originally consisted of people from each of these different provinces going in areas that were adjacent to their province. And so it who conquered the east, who conquered Turkestan, Khorasan, Pakistan, that is Sindh, which is Pakistan, etc., and so on. But what happened was that in order to tighten the ship of state and control it, after having many revolts happen against them, the Syrian army, which was the biggest part of the whole army, started to place garrisons of Syrian troops or groups of Syrian troops in the midst of these other troops and all these other provinces. And most of that. And that a basis for great dissatisfaction. And Iraq, which had revolted repeatedly there, the two military cities of Basra then were major cities that were disloyal to the Umayyad Caliphate and resisting it. So Umayyads built a new city called Wasit, which means in the middle, right in the middle between Basra and Kufa, as their garrison city to hold Iraq. So it was like Iraq was kind of under military occupation in a way. And at the same time, the Umayyads became less willing to support the other non-Syrians with stipends out of the treasury, that is, the troops from these other areas. And so the people in those areas became very dissatisfied and rebelled. And the rebellion in North Africa of the North Africans broke the back of the Umayyad Caliphate. And that occurred on the 15th of Ramadan, 7. The Amazighis or Berbers rebelled around Tangier, which is in the very far west, and killed the governor. And that revolt was never quelled. It continued, and the Umayyad Caliph Hisham sent a huge army, said about this revolt, I will rage against them with an Arab rage, and I will send them an army whose front is where they are and whose rear end is where I am. In other words, I'll fill over 1,000 miles with an army. And he sent out this big army, and it was annihilated in the battle of near Fes in Morocco. And as a result, the Umayyads lost all of North Africa, and they fought to hold on to Tunisia, and they were able to, but they lost Algeria, Morocco, and of course was cut off. So the people in Spain, so my governor withdrew, had to, and they therefore separated also. So Spain became separate. Spain, Portugal, Morocco, Algeria were never recovered by the caliphate. So the year 740 is the year in which the political unity of the Muslims was ended forever and never came back after that. And then on the Eastern Front, the Abbasid Revolution broke out in Khorasan, and it took in 747, and it took a number of years, but basically the Khorasani army joined it and defeated the other Umayyad armies sent against it, and Caliphate was overthrown by that. The Umayyads had also engaged in their own internal politics, where when the army that was sent from Syria to North Africa was destroyed, there were basically no troops left in Syria used up. And result was remaining leadership made a coup d'etat of Walid II, killed him, and tried to implement a more liberalizing policy that would decentralize the caliphate and so on. But it's too late. It was rejected and overthrown. And so the Umayyad Caliphate simply weakened itself by also that internal division. And so the Abbasids came and wiped out the Umayyads, and they went and wiped out the Umayyad princes at the massacre of Eros in Palestine. They invited 80 Umayyad princes to a banquet to, explain how they were giving them an amnesty and forgiving them, and they placed a servant with a sword behind every one of them and slaughtered them all in a big massacre. So they tried to massacre all the Umayyads. And one Umayyad escaped to the west and eventually gathered others with him, and that was Abdurrahman al-Dakhil, who, after some years, found the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba in Spain. So the Umayyad Caliphate continued in Spain for almost 300 more years, and the Abbasids weren't able to get it. They couldn't get to it. It was too far away. Were unable to conquer except as far as Tunisia. That was it. They conquered. They could not get farther than that. So the unity of the Muslims was lost, and the political unity was lost, and that also started the devolution and downward course of the caliphate. Of course, the whole history of the Abbasid Caliphate was a rather miserable history of after they reached high water mark in 762, their state simply shrank and shrank and shrank and shrank until it disappeared, just lost territory after territory. And the Abbasids tried to establish a more centralizing regime, but that just aroused more local up in the provinces and caused the provinces to.
Thank you so much, Professor Khalid. I think we'll leave it at that. It's been incredibly informative speaking with you, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Brother Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Professor.